I was born in Rochester, New York, at Genesee Hospital on Alexander Street. It was on November 21st, 1930. Yes, I was. My first school was a public nursery school. My mother's goal was to have me be as much of a normal student as possible and socialize with hearing students. I didn't realize it, but I was left out in nursery school. I remember crying for 2 or 3 days. My father's Aunt Hattie, who was called Miss Andrews, was teaching first grade at RSD. She had retired by that time, and she encouraged my mother to try the Rochester School for the Deaf. That convinced my mother, who then decided to send me to RSD, Rochester School for the Deaf. In nursery school, I saw all these kids signing, and I thought it was amazing. That was the beginning. Yes, positively. It was fingerspelling all the time, no signs at all. I used home signs and gestures. We weren't really exposed to ASL at that time. We used home signs. That's a good question. Malone School for the Deaf was located in Malone, New York. The school closed in the 1950s, so a lot of the students from there moved to RSD. Students from Malone signed, so that was the beginning of our introduction to sign language and fingerspelling at the Rochester School for the Deaf. My sister is also deaf. She was born 3 years before me. Yes, she did. No. My father fingerspelled, but my mom refused to fingerspell. She believed strictly in oral communication. My father would fingerspell because my father learned it from playing with deaf children when he was 12 years old at RSD, so he picked up fingerspelling there. She taught first grade. Yes, with my father. Oh yes, we'd sign and fingerspell. There were a few homemade signs we shared. So my father entered RSD when he was 12 years old. My great-aunt, my aunt, was teaching at RSD at that time. She brought my father to introduce him to play with deaf boys, to play baseball and other games. That's how my father picked up fingerspelling and gestures. He became good friends with some of those deaf boys. Later on, they worked for my father at Lawyers Cooperative Printing Company. Later on, my father was also a Boy Scout leader at RSD for Troop 29. He tried to organize flag classes and other programs. One of his scouts became the first Deaf Eagle Scout. First, I failed the Gallaudet University admissions test. So my father thought I should go on to RIT for printing. I agreed it was a good idea. Printing was a good profession for deaf people at that time, so I accepted the idea. One thing I want to mention is modern lithography. At that time, we didn't have modern lithography. We worked on old systems, like linotype and linopress machines, basically typing. Yes. Right. Sometimes I would go into his shop where they were working. There would be many, many linotype operators up on the second floor, all in a row. I remember going in and talking with each one of them because I knew them. My father's boss would say that it's time for your son to cut that out. I got to know all of them, and we became good friends. During World War II, they hired deaf operators because the linotype machines were so noisy. I knew every single one of those deaf operators on the night shift. It was interesting. Now there is only two deaf linotype operators who are currently living. 2 years. The Clark Building on the downtown campus. My first class was in photography, but I hated my photography teacher. He was so oral. The classroom was a long, oblong room. And there were narrow horizontal windows in front of me, and the teacher was way up in the front of the class. And I had a hard time seeing them because I was blinded by the window's light, and I couldn't read his lips. It was a poor setup for deaf people to understand the teacher in the Clark Building. It wasn't very deaf-friendly. Yes, there were a couple of students the same age as me from the Rochester School for the Deaf. One of them was Eddie Cruikshank, and the second one was Sammy Parker. Both were in the School for American Craftsmen. Sammy Parker was a carpenter. He worked with wood. Eddie was a weaver, and he made ties. I had a hard time at first. I had to pick out the professors whose lips I could read. It was hard for me to communicate with the teachers. There were no interpreters. There were no note takers. So I asked my father for a special tutor, and he hired a private tutor. Most of the tutors refused to take notes for me. It was a weird thing, so my father hired one fellow to take notes. And he had to do it. It was his job, and he needed the money. It was good, but it was difficult for me to understand the vocabulary words. I would go home and I would ask my father to help with the homework, and to help decipher the notes. It was overwhelming for me. My vocabulary was pretty weak at that time. Yes, I took the subway. No, never. I was asked to join Gamma Phi, the printing fraternity, because of my experience with the Pi Club, a printing club. I also worked on the RIT Reporter student magazine. I drew cartoons. At night school, I took charcoal sketching and portraits because I wanted to specialize in portraits. Charcoal sketches. I was also involved in baseball because they found out that I was a catcher at the Rochester School for the Deaf, and RIT needed a catcher. The other players were afraid of catching because it's a dangerous sport. I played for the Rochester School for the Deaf. So when I transferred to RIT, I was used to it. It was easy for me, but communication would break down. Actually, the communication between hearing students was terrible, but we got along. I met the tennis coach at RIT. He was the printing instructor. He taught letterpress, so I knew him. I asked him, "Do you ever play ping pong?" "I know you play tennis, but what about ping pong?" He said, "Oh, I'm very skilled at ping pong. We should play sometime." That's how I found out about our mutual love of ping pong. So he invited Sammy Parker. Sammy and I played ping pong at the Rochester School for the Deaf. Sammy was very skilled. Sammy had joined the tennis team, so the three of us got along very well. I have good memories of that. The tennis teacher's name was Bakir Arpag. He passed away at the age of 92. He suggested setting up a ping pong tournament during the winter season. That tournament became very successful. It was very popular. I was disappointed it wasn't at another location. Sammy Parker and I played at the Rochester School for the Deaf. It built experience and trust between Sammy Parker and me. The tournament had 52 participants and was set up in 2 brackets. Sammy Parker and I were in opposite brackets. In the end, it came down to just him and me. We were competing for the championship game. He beat me by 1 point. Bob Panera. Yes, he was teaching at Gallaudet, and he would come to Rochester for visits, and he was considering coming to RIT. I thought it was a great idea. I knew Mrs. Shumway, who was a member of the board of directors. We talked about RIT being such a great place. That's how it started. I was so happy to see the establishment of RIT and the changes for deaf students at NTID. At that time, there were no interpreters. There was one deaf woman from RSD who was hard of hearing, who signed and fingerspelled, and she became an interpreter at RIT. She was very helpful and organized the sign language interpreting program. Alice Beardsley, was the very first person to influence the foundations of interpreting at RIT. Later on, I remember Florence Hughes and Karen Finch very well. I saw Florence Hughes at a play about 2 months ago. I was so happy to see her, even though she didn't remember me. Yes, many times. I'd meet some friends there, other students, and get advice from people. I was inspired to become a printing teacher at NTID. I was interviewed 3 times, but turned down. Because my experience was with the older printing systems. Yes, many times. I really wanted to help deaf students with printing, but it didn't work out. Yes, I did. I would go to the library first thing in the morning to finish my homework. I asked the librarian at the desk some questions. I had many questions in the course of several days. She would get books for me. One time I asked Frances, my wife, a question. At that time, I didn't know her. She was one of the librarians working there, and I would ask her to help me look over some notes. At first, I would write notes, and we would exchange them back and forth. At that time, there was a fraternity dance that was coming up. The Half Moon. Yes, right. Thank you, that's what it was. It was held in the fall, and a fraternity brother asked if I wanted to double date. Just to let you know, I was driving. I would have wanted to put my arm around a girl, but I was shy. But no matter, I would drive. So the date was set. I needed a girl, so one of the fraternity boys, George Haddam, I asked him to set me up with any old girl he could find. I met one of the friends of Frances, my wife, who was living at that time in the girls' dormitory. My fraternity brother George asked one of the girls in the dormitory to ask around for me. She said she would find out, and asked quite a few girls if they wanted to go out with a deaf boy. Finally, one girl volunteered, and it was Frances. At that time, she had no experience with deafness or fingerspelling. So before the dance, I met her at the first floor of the dormitory in the hallway. There must have been 4 floors or so. When I met her, I said, "Hi, Frances. I'm John." I had met her through my brother, George Hatton. I asked her what formal dress color she would be wearing. Frances conferred with another woman, and she responded with, "Green." "But why would you ask?" I told her I wanted to buy a corsage flower to match her green dress, and I thanked her. I asked George when we would be going out, and we set a time. When that was all done, I said my goodbyes and told her when I would be picking her up. I happened to know fraternity brothers through our printing class. The fraternity asked me to join, and I knew one of the brothers from the printing program, and he wanted me to be involved and help out in whatever they might need. So I was willing to be involved and see what would happen. I was brave at that time. I would try numerous things to break through the barriers. I was curious in that way. Most of the brothers spoke without signing, but luckily I knew some of them already from the printing department. It was successful. I was on committees several times. Nothing. None of them asked me anything about deafness. Nothing. They had no exposure to deafness. No one asked any questions. The professors all spoke, and during class, it was hard for me to get along. I preferred hands-on work, working with things that I could touch. I preferred learning that way, with the printing press machine itself. I learned best that way. One of the professors was the advisor for our fraternity. The linotype teacher, Fred Gutfrucht or something like that, he was ever so good to me. He would meet with me regularly and ask how I was doing. We'd type back and forth on the linotype equipment. A linotype machine has little metal pieces that you put together in a slug. It was an old system that we used. Dr. Gutfrucht, was very kind. He was always close to me and made sure I was taken care of. He was so patient, checking up on me. I really liked Fred. The art department, the women, they were good, and I got along just fine with the design people. Dr. Ellingson was a very good friend of my father's. Dr. Ellingson was on the board of RIT, the president of RIT. He and my father were very good friends, so there were a lot of outside connections with RIT. They helped one another out. Well, I think most of them are gone by now. It was at the Eastman Theater. However, I wasn't there. I graduated in August, so there wasn't any graduation ceremony. I had missed it. The ceremony was in May, and I graduated in August, so there wasn't any ceremony for me. Oh, that was easy. My father got the job for me at a small printing company called colonial lithography in the offset department. Oh boy, that was exactly what I wanted. Then I met the owner of the printing company, who came from Germany. It was very difficult to speech read him, but we did get along. He said he needed a cameraman, and I was so excited because my specialty was with photography and the use of a camera. So I said I'd try out the job for 3.5 years, alone. I was the only one there at any time of day or night. It was specialty printing, doing international work, yearbooks for high schools. I did the whole job alone. It took a lot of time to process the pictures. I worked many overtime hours. Yes, my boss just really cherished the job I was doing. He wanted to keep me and have me stay in it. It was good, and the overtime pay was good. So I stayed on for 3.5 years. 3.5 years. I stayed in the same department and worked with a camera, stripping, and printmaking. Those 3 things were in one department. I'd work in the darkroom, stripping, cutting the negatives, mounting them, and then you'd expose it for the offset plate, and that was my job. For 3.5 years. My first job at the Lawyers Co-op was for Microlux. They tried to develop a new system for reducing one page to the size of a thumb, and then have all of the pages of a book on one card. It was to save room in the library. That way, all these book pages could fit on one card. They were trying to compress, just to save space and rent for the lawyers. It was not successful. Well, I had tried. So, in my next job at Lawyers Cooperative, they put me into the plate-making department. I worked there for several months, and then I was transferred to camera, and then back to plate making. I kind of bounced around a little bit, but that's where I stayed for 31 years. I was in research trying to do the new technologies in offset printing at the Lawyers Co-op. I was the sole plate maker working with the camera and linotype. The old linotype system used hot metal that you cut into pieces. Then they changed the technology so each matrix had a film that was exposed and printed. This required numerous camera pictures of each slice of film. When that was finished, I developed them and stripped them and put them on pages. Oh, yes. I really like to start something new and innovative. Communication was a problem. People on the outside didn't want to make the effort to talk with me. There was a posting of promotions. Promotion opportunities were posted. I'd interview, and then I would be turned down because I was deaf. At that time, people were behind in their knowledge and acceptance of deaf people. We were seen as having a handicap, and we were just pushed aside. I tried 3 times for different positions, and each time I'd be turned down. The upper management didn't know much about deaf people or how to communicate with them. At that time, we weren't provided with interpreters. I had a tough time, but I accepted it. So I decided to retire early and just get out of it. 1989. Because of my eye. I had a detached retina in my left eye, so I had to stop working for 6 months. Then I retired. I was out for 1 year and then went back to work. And it happened again, but this time in my right eye. I had a detached retina, and it really scared me. So I decided to retire. I didn't want it to happen again because I'm deaf and I cherish my eyesight. That's a good question. Many of the people who took my place felt very awkward in the job. They'd call me in to come and help out and do a lot of training of new employees. They had no experience. One of the boys was deaf, and he was a very difficult person to train. When I retired, the boss asked me to come back again and again to train them, and I said, "I'm sorry, I don't have safety shoes. I don't have them on." And my boss was so angry because he wanted me to help teach and retrain them. And it was cheaper for the lawyers' co-op to have me do it because of my experience. After I retired, the lawyers' co-op hired people from Kodak who had experience. So they added 2 more employees to take my place. And those 2 didn't have enough experience. Yes, no experience, just one, Santo Valenti, who worked on the night shift under me. When I retired, he moved up and took my place. My boss had a real hard time communicating with him, and he didn't read lips nor talk. So he depended on me. My boss bothered me a lot. I finally said, "You know what? I don't have any safety shoes which are required for work. So sorry I can't help you out anymore." Oh, he was so mad at me. George Hakem would call my wife since I was busy at that time. Sometimes I'd be willing to come in and train those people. By the time I had retired in 1989, I was involved with the Boy Scouts. Boy Scouts. Boy Scouts. I was involved with the Boy Scouts after I retired. And one friend, Lester Zimmett, we were good friends. He asked me to help him set up an answering service for TTYs. At that time, there were only 5 TTY owners. In what year? 1989. There were only 5 TTYs. The Model 15 was one of the old teletype machines. There were the Model 15, 28, the Lorentz, and it was tough going. But I learned the ropes through Lester Zimmett. And I learned to fix the machines. Yes, and I'd make house calls. or I'd go on the calls to fix any problems with the machines. The TTY was made from old teletype machines that were used for Morse code. With notes. Yes, but most of the notes weren't that important. Yes, but it was really boring. I was required to attend the meetings. They told me to be patient. There was a note taker that would take notes on the whole thing throughout the meeting, such as what companies like Lawyers Cooperative Publishing, LCP, were doing, what the future was looking like, giving updates. The lights for the doorbell. There was one old deaf man in the building who made homemade doorbells. He would connect a wire from the door all the way into another room. At that time, there was no wireless. That was my first one. I gave it to the archives, and then later wireless systems were developed. At that time, I was married to Frances. I hated to miss the doorbell, especially if I was home alone. That was in the 50s, maybe 1954 and on. My dog helped me answer the door. Yes, he would always answer the doorbell, and I would follow him. Yes. Later on, though, a light would flash. The clock would wake me up by flashing. I had a doorbell with a light. We had a telephone. And we had a baby crying signal, so when the baby would cry, the light would flash. We have 3. The first one is Betsy, who's right here, and then 2 boys, Tim and Fred. Yes, they're all hearing. Betsy does. I'm closer to her. I noticed that girls learn faster than boys do. Boys are not quite as observant. Betsy maintains eye contact very well. That's what I need. Eye-to-eye contact. When I first met Frances on our first date, I noticed that she had good eye contact. That's the girl I wanted, I said. I dated other hearing girls, but they would all just be looking around. They really wouldn't look at me in the eyes, so I made note of that. When I dated Frances, we went to the George Eastman house on East Avenue to watch the silent movies. That's why it was important. A lot of deaf people would attend those silent movies. It was an exciting event for the 2 of us to attend. Frances didn't have to interpret the whole movie. It was cool for me. I was happy. From time to time, I would teach Frances fingerspelling and signs. Lester Zimmett asked me to set up a telecommunications TTY answering service. Yeah, it was complicated. A hearing person would call the center, which had TTYs, and they would call a deaf person, right? TTYs were used in the center to make calls to deaf people. The first one was at a Penfield nursing home. We set up training for the nurses. They would take some time off to help when the calls came in. There were 5 members of that answering service. I trained 2 or 3 girls, plus the nurses, to catch the calls that came in. It was a slow process, but it grew. It grew steadily to 28. 28 deaf people wanted to join the answering service. That was such an overwhelming thing for the nurse volunteers. So I asked MCAHI, Mackay, the Monroe County Association for the Hearing Impaired, which was an organization with programs to help the deaf. Shumway, Hetty Shumway. Mrs. Shumway was there at Mackay, and we were good friends, so I asked her if she would please help out. She said, "Sure, I'll do anything for the deaf community." She was a wonderful woman, Mrs. Shumway. I loved her. So I met the director of Mackay, Sue Sherleff. I tried to contact her to find out what happened. And I don't know whether she was married or whether she passed away. There's no trace of her. I wanted to talk with her about our memories of the Monroe County Association for the Hearing Impaired. Well, I started working with the Boy Scouts. I helped out with Boy Scout Troop 49. And then my church set up a new church near my home, so I transferred to that other church. And there they set up the new Troop 77. Oh no, not at all. All of the boys were hearing. Troop 49 was first. They were all hearing boys as well. And when I transferred to Troop 77, I was an assistant scoutmaster. So maybe there were 5 or 6 assistant scoutmasters. I was only involved in that for a short time. So the new church set up the new troop, number 77, and I was an assistant scoutmaster, so I was helping out with the programming. Only programs, no events, like learning how to tie knots. At one point, the scoutmaster just quit. There was no one to take his place. The board asked me to be a scoutmaster. I said, "What? A scoutmaster? For all those hearing boys?" They were like, "Oh, but you can do it. You'll be good at it." They just said, "Try for maybe 3 months or so." I gave it a try. I ended up speaking in front of the boys. There were a few problems at first, but 2 or 3 years later, the troop kept growing and growing and growing because of my involvement as a scoutmaster. I invented new programs and new ways of organizing the troop. I recruited 10 fathers to help on the committee. I delegated jobs to each one of them. Improvements, planning, camping, 2 for each, and 1 guy to be the backup. It was so successful. The troop grew and kept on growing. Initially, the charter had 30 boys listed and grew to 77 boys. It was overcrowded. The 10 fathers set up beautiful programs. I like to delegate jobs to the different fathers. I was deaf and unable to speak, but I gave them all jobs to do. It was very successful. The word of Troop 77 spread and continued to grow to 77 boys. The room was full of people. Standing room only. It didn't make me nervous at all, because I had 10 assistant scoutmasters behind me, and each one of them had their own programs to do. Camping was successful. Advancement, Court of Honor. Through my experience over the years, my eyes knew what to expect. The Scout office asked me to split the troop in half because they had grown so large. But I said, "What? Split? How?" That would mean having 2 scoutmasters. I would be the scoutmaster for Troop 1 and another for Troop B? No way. So I left. It was impossible to force me to do that. So I joined Lester Zimmett to set up a TTY answering service. That was the start of moving from a hearing world to a deaf world. Oh, thank you. While being Scoutmaster for 77 boys, we easily had 5 Eagle Scouts at one time. Other years there would be 1 or 2, but we had 5 because they had so much help with all of these beautiful programs and competitions that were set up. We were so successful that the word spread like wildfire. One troop challenged us to a competition. Troop 19, Tay House, if I remember. They were near my home. They wanted a knot tying contest and other Boy Scout related games. And it was a really hot competition. It was fun. It was a friendly competition, and the games were pretty close. It was very successful and very popular with the boys. I was sorry I had to leave scouting, but I had to because Lester Zimmett wanted me to be involved with and help with the New York Relay Service. I thought it was more important to help deaf people. They needed the service to improve, so I answered their call. Amazing! Amazing! When NTID was established at RIT, it made me so happy to see deaf people involved with new technologies. And looking back, I really wish I was alive at that time to be able to be there and teach. I'm so thankful to Dr. Ellingson, who decided to move the RIT campus from downtown to Henrietta. Lots of them. I wish I could be young again, to experience them myself.